Parker Lewis in the house, the man who needs no introduction.
That's right.
Everybody in this space knows you. Let's get you.
Finally got him on here, man. It was tough. He's a high demand individual.
We'll get the Bitcoin meetup tonight, so
yeah, I'm not gonna be able to.
I was like, you're captive. I was like, you pretty much have to do this podcast.
Yeah, we've been talking about this for a while. Come down every month for the meetup, so glad that we could actually sit around the table and
we've only been doing the show for like 18 months now. That's all. Yeah,
dude, we're like 30, 40 episodes deep now.
Yeah, I think we're over 40. We haven't released all of them.
Yeah, we haven't released all of them.
We've kind of finally got a backlog.
I feel like my full-time job is this podcast now.
I know.
As many podcasts as we've been doing.
But it's fun, though.
It's been fun.
I freaking love it, man. It's
an important subject. The intersections of Bitcoin.
Sometimes
and
I'm like,
energy.
man, I've learned so much about Bitcoin just from doing this podcast and mining in particular. Other times I'm like, I'm deeper into it. I don't know shit.
Right.
It's a deep rabbit hole.
It is a deep rabbit hole. It is. And yes, I brought up your book and we did a weird intro, but whatever. Your book gradually, then suddenly, what did you release a month or two ago?
Released it in December. So,
was it that long ago? Dang. Well,
time flies.
Yeah, it is flying. But I haven't finished it, like I said, but I've gotten into it. And again, you write in a super clean, easy to understand way that I read Bitcoin Standard. It's good. I'm not at all knocking it. It's incredible. But I think for people that I talk to a lot, which are a lot of either young people, like my daughter's age and up to like Sarah's daughter's age, 25, that didn't have any type of really exposure to it or need to. I come from a small town, and like a lot of the people I talk to are from small towns, and I don't know if there's the same there isn't the same kind of emphasis on economic policy, all the different monetary system and what's fiat currency. It's simple, man. You live in a farming town, it's agriculture, construction, military, and that's it really. So I talked to a lot of those people, and I don't know if the Bitcoin Standard would be as effective as actually what you wrote. That's why what I'm telling you is like, I think it's really important book to get to people in more rural areas that are not going to understand all the stuff that is in Bitcoin Standard. I think this is probably, I'm not just pumping this up because you're here. I really think that that's the type of writing that can be more impactful on a bigger swath of people rather than just, people that understand kind of economic policy and whatnot. This makes more sense.
Yeah, I think, and I'll always say, so the Bitcoin Standard was formative for me. My friendship with Safety Namus, who wrote it before he had even written it, helped me start to unlock questions about what is money, and even his early transcript that he shared with me before he released the Bitcoin Standard, kind of allowed a lot of the pieces to fit into place for me. But then even beyond there were a lot of questions that I had to work through and order logically in order to consistently arrive back at the conclusion that Bitcoin is money. And I think that Safe's book does a great job at the Bitcoin Standard, particularly on the history of money and kind of more of kind of the economic and academic perspective of the historical role of money, and then how Bitcoin ties into that. Mine, I kind of focused it more kind of going straight into, let me help you understand, a framework to logically understand Bitcoin as money. And let's think about it relative to the dollar and the things that we know to be money, and how in part this might challenge it, but let's kind of start from the bottom up. And I also, for my own self, even though I've, went to school and got an economics degree, try to write in a very plain language that's attacking that exact question. That's okay, if I'm going to logically make the case for Bitcoin as money, how can I communicate that in a way that isn't, kind of tied in more academic theory, but more rooted in just, ones and zeros, dollars and cents, logical order.
See, you just explained what I was trying to say better than I did.
So was that your main motivation? Was like, hey, like I just want to like break things down in the most simple of terms, and that's why, because a book is a massive undertaking. You and I were talking about this a couple months ago, of just like how much time and how much effort goes into like writing like an entire book. So was the main idea here just to like break it down for layman's?
Yeah, it was, and through the because it really was trying to kind of bridge the gap. And like, honestly, the way I think about the Bitcoin Standard, it was, I remember reading it on a plane down to Nicaragua, and I was just like feverishly taking notes, and it was just like everything was fitting into place. Like the ideas were clicking. But then from there, from that point to my kind of hardened view of Bitcoin, I kind of took those ideas and had to work through certain things that I was not necessarily struggling with, but that I connected, but I needed to have a more kind of clear delineation just in terms of the way that my brain worked. And then I thought, well, if I still need a few things to kind of really piece it together, that other people would benefit, because certainly other people's minds might or should work similarly to my own.
Yeah.
And so if I could just get those frameworks and ordered, I don't like to think about it as arguments, but ordered frameworks, then that would benefit or help accelerate other people whose minds work similarly to my own. And that's also why my perspective is, the more content that's out there, the more books, the more podcasts, people relate to different people in different ways, and something's going to help somebody relate faster than others. And so, yeah, my, kind of purpose of initially starting the body of work, which started out as really a newsletter that morphed into a more substantive kind of body of work on the internet, was to kind of help kind of piece some things together and help answer questions for people in the way that I had to kind of logically order them. And through that process, like I would just dump things out of my brain onto paper, and then have to go through and, rigorously, not necessarily challenge ideas, but really get to the substance in not just the most efficient way, but in my way of, if like something was missing in terms of connecting an idea, not putting something out until I felt like it was actually the most logically ordered argument that it could be.
Yeah.
That you're right, because like when I read it, I'm like, man, I wish I would have read something like this like 7-8 years ago. It'd been great. Obviously there wasn't something out like that 7 or 8 years ago, but I do think it's that impactful, because like I was trying to think, 21-year-old me, if I read that, or I'd read Safety Dean's book, that one will probably talk to me. Yours will probably connect with me more so than his. And that's not, again, an indictment. It goes back to what you were just saying, which is some things are going to just click with some people differently than others, and the way they write it or the way they communicate, will reach audiences that are different from each other. And yours definitely, like, I'm excited to get like my daughter and Sarah's daughters to read it, just because I think that were the areas where I struggle to explain Bitcoin to them, that book definitely is going to kind of open their eyes to some of the things, because I think they think a lot more like I do, just from that at that age, and coming from where they're from, being in a very rural area where you don't really think about a ton of this stuff until, things have gotten so bad that you're like, why is my dollar not going anywhere anymore? I can't buy the same type of things I could buy before. Why does it cost me 3 times as much to, buy a combine than it did freaking 10 years ago? So I think you did a great job, and I'm excited to finish the book so I can let some other folks borrow it or send it out. I'd encourage a lot of people to go get it. But
so I feel like the Bitcoin space is like very like mission oriented, right? And whenever I think of that, one of the first people I think of is you in this space, just with everything from the book to the meetup to everything else you've done in this space. I want to pose the question to you, like, how would you define your mission, especially like with this? Like what are you hoping to accomplish?
So I do think that a lot of people who work on Bitcoin, I think certainly first and foremost, and not shying away at all, is that, hey, kind of when I first started down this path, I had connected or at least developed my own conviction and logic around why Bitcoin would emerge as the global reserve currency. And that just from a pure selfish economic interest perspective, that if that were to be true, then the best thing I could possibly spend my time on would be Bitcoin. In terms of, if this is the way the world's going, then my own self-interest, the best thing I can do would be to spend time working on that. It would be similar to if you were my age and figured out that the internet was going to be what it would become, then you would spend time, kind of investing in skills that would be valuable to that future world. So I think it certainly was and still is self-interested. But that also, I think the thing that you're keying in on is that it also is something that drives a lot of purpose and is very purposeful, because they're, we're not just out here trying to make the world a better place. That might be a derivative outcome, but when you start to really understand Bitcoin, you start to understand the consequences of money printing. And, a lot of what I talk about in the book is also the problems of the dollar. Oftentimes people look at Bitcoin as a solution in search of a problem, but it's because they don't understand the problem and the extent of it and the consequences of it. But when you do, you realize, hey, like the stakes are high, not just because I'm personally so invested in Bitcoin, wrote a book about Bitcoin, but if our money fails, if money breaks down, then the future, whether it's, the future of us as individuals, families, communities, it's all at risk. And so it is very easy to, and it's why working on Bitcoin is so rewarding for so many people, is that there's this sense of purpose that comes with it, or this higher purpose or this mission, like Cenk mentioned, and that it's almost done out of necessity, not just out of opportunity. And that, I've personally found it rewarding, but also have found success in it, because when you're working on something and it actually is a higher purpose, then you can actually pursue individual projects and goals that bear meaningful fruit in your own self-interest. And it's actually the thing that aligns all interests, having a good form of money. And so I think that, there's certain people that work on, different pieces of SaaS software to, make X, Y, or Z better. And then they talk about making the world a better place. And it's kind of this hollow thing. But if you recognize that our money's broken and you recognize the consequence of money, and then you recognize, hey, here's this thing, Bitcoin, that's presented as the solution, and, it actually works, then working on that thing kills two birds with one stone. You can protect your own self-interest, but you can actually pursue projects that, help secure all of our futures. And there's not many projects that can rise to that level.
Right. So you do talk about this in the book too, but what was your journey of like discovery? I know you said in the book, like 2016 was when you got into it, but what was kind of the process up to that and to where you're at today? Obviously, kind of being one of the thought leaders in the space, but yeah, what was that like? You're an economic major, and then kind of how did you get there?
Yeah, so I'd worked in traditional financial services, worked in investment banking straight out of school, doing mergers and acquisitions. Had worked in credit restructuring and interim management, turnaround management for companies that had gone through bankruptcies or similar type of financial distress. Then that led me ultimately to work at a hedge fund in Dallas. And I was really going down two separate paths of research. One, the firm while I was there had kind of evolved from kind of focusing on credits and deep value equities, which is really what I'd been brought in to do, to focusing more on, quote, global macro. And it was at a time where the Fed was signaling that it was going to unwind post-financial crisis QE. So the Fed had, in response to the financial crisis in 2008, come in and digitally created or printed 3.6 trillion new dollars starting in late 2008, but going through 2014. In this time frame, 2016, they started to signal that they were going to start to take those dollars out of the system. And I was pursuing research at the fund that I was at, trying to come to my own perspective or develop my own framework of thinking about, well, what will happen when they start to reverse this out? And through that process, jumping forward, kind of long story short, I figured out that they weren't going to be able to do that. They were always going to have to print more money at large scale, and that ultimately it would end poorly for all of us, and that would end in hyperinflation of the currency, that the currency would fail. So I figured out why they were always going to have to print more money, that they were always going to have to do it, and that was a problem.
Which is interesting. Sorry to cut you off, but it was interesting is that you saw the problem with the fiat currency first and then the Bitcoin, whereas a lot of us come to Bitcoin and then realize like, oh, then you learn all the problems and you learn the importance of Bitcoin.
Right.
But you came about from the totally different
yeah.
side.
And I think I had to, because I was somebody that was traditionally schooled in this, Keynesian economic world of this is the way the world works and this is a net positive. But we all are
and don't even realize it. You know what I mean? We're all trained that way. Like totally. That's why when people that don't know, like coming from a small town, like we're not schooled in Keynesian economics, but we are without even realizing it.
Yeah, that's all around us.
I like this book, but yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, absolutely, because it is. It's ingrained in everything. It's the way the world works, and it's the way the only world that we've ever known has ever worked. Right. And so kind of, but I was far enough removed from education and 10 years into a career in finance that I could look at it from a world of experience. And so I came to that conclusion, and then coinciding with that, and I do think that people that are more traditionally schooled in economics are predisposed to not be able to see Bitcoin.
Yeah,
because they're inherently, further ingrained and inherently they're apologists for like, no, this is the way that it has to work, right? But then coinciding with that, I was asked to go due diligence on a gold company in Canada. And serendipitously, however you want to describe it, like I was somebody at the time who would have considered gold, there's a saying that gold's a barbaric relic. It's a shiny rock. I have no need for that. I'd rather have, guns and cows, right?
Yeah.
There's the saying that gold's a barbaric relic. I just never contemplated gold being a form of money. And there was this gold back payments platform in Canada that I was asked to go do due diligence on. And it was called BitGold. And it talked about blockchain. And I had a good friend, Will Cole, who I've, one of my best friends since preschool, that I'm, now collaborating with in the Bitcoin space, previously at Unchained, now at Zapright. And he was involved in Bitcoin. What that meant, I have no idea, but he was interested in it at least. So I reached out to him and asked him about it. And he looked at the website for a brief second and quickly identified that it had nothing to do with Bitcoin, but that he had a gold guy. And that gold guy turned out to be Safety Moose.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you, how did you guys connect? So that's how, okay.
Yeah. And so we exchanged several emails. He happened to be he and his wife were expecting their first child at the time. And they happened to be, even though they lived on another continent, they happened to be in Canada while they were expecting. So, and he happened to be 2 hours away from the meeting that I was going to, and he suggested, "Hey, why don't I just come up to this meeting?" And then that's the serendipity of it, or the world working in a mysterious way. But through that process, he helped me understand why gold had emerged as money, and the whole side of what is money, what makes a better form of money, what's the worst form of money. And then through that process, like really unlocking my mind to, okay, I've figured out that they're always gonna have to print more money. I figured out it's a problem. Here I am going down this gold rabbit hole, and start talking to my friend Will more and more about Bitcoin and the relationships between gold and Bitcoin. And then Safe in that window, 12-month period, started writing an early draft of the Bitcoin Standard, shared it with me, discussing those ideas. And I started to figure out why Bitcoin had fundamental value, or at least in my mind. And it was that there was fundamental value in Bitcoin's fixed supply if it could be credibly enforced, because if it could, then it would represent a form of money that can't be printed. And that's where I started to be able to piece these two paths of research together, that on one hand, they're always going to have to print more money. I figured out why, and that it's a problem. And here's this thing, Bitcoin, that was expressly designed to solve the problem, because that's also something that's not as well understood, but very clearly Bitcoin was intentionally created to solve a problem of central banks and governments printing money. And it kind of fit into place of I was pursuing these two paths of research that I viewed to be independent of each other, but they were incredibly intertwined. And that my most simplistic conclusion was, hey, this thing Bitcoin is the solution to this thing, the dollar. And that if the problem is printing money, then the only logical solution to that is a form of money that can't be printed.
Dude, okay, this is where I could get my tinfoil hat, but so that story makes me feel even more confident. I think there's like a spiritual aspect to Bitcoin. I really do. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I really honestly think that, yeah, right. I think there's something to it. I know my journey into it, right? Yeah, here we go. My journey into it.
This is the thumbnail.
Right. This. Yeah, screw this. I gotta be serious when I'm saying this, because I honestly believe it. I really think that my journey to it, it came from like an internal thing that was just pulling me into Bitcoin, and I didn't know for sure what I wanted to do in it. I didn't understand Bitcoin the way I do now. I hadn't even read the Bitcoin Standard at the time, but I just felt a weird draw to it, and there was opportunities from the mining side. So I came from oil and gas, and I saw an opportunity to generate value from for a molecule of gas that wouldn't have, you can't realize on a traditional market in the natural gas world right now. So that's what led me into it. But there was this underlying draw that I just couldn't shake, and I knew I was supposed to get into it, and I knew I was going to get into it. I knew the money that I needed to get Jay started was going to come somehow. Didn't know what it was. The entire leap of faith that I took to get there was internally driven. And then when you talk about the way you meet Safedine, is like that's a spiritual thing, man. That's like a God thing. And to think of the way I view Bitcoin now as being an answer to these fiat currency issues, and the way governments can manipulate people and other governments through their monetary system. I feel like this is actually, it's something that I think God uses people to create things that are going to change the world. I don't think it's always just like a bolt of lightning and all of a sudden something happens. I think he uses us to do things, and I think that's probably part of the reason Bitcoin came about. And then when you tell stories like that of how you make Safedine and all this stuff shakes out, I don't see how anybody could even argue that.
Bitcoin shaman.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have thought about that too. Like, just
don't you feel that in the undertones of the world right now?
There's a part of it where, like, I've thought about, like, think about all the things that had to happen to, allow my path to cross with Safe at that point, or even in the circumstance, like, I had never met the person. I'm just corresponding to him on the internet, basically. My friend Will had not ever actually met Safe in person, and he suggests, hey, I can come to these meetings with you. And, in my state, I'm working for a hedge fund in Dallas. I like to think of it since reformed, but saying like, yeah, sure. I could have easily said, appreciate the offer, but I've got this covered. And
most people would have, most people, especially coming from where you came from, like that's what most people would have done.
Yeah. And then I also found out that, like, only later, like several years later, I met a guy who was a very early Bitcoiner, without saying names, but he was actually selling his shares in the company that I was diligencing And the whole reason why I was up there was to diligence the shares that he was selling.
Really?
Yeah. But I didn't know it at the time,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
And I do think, though, what you're talking about too is, and it might come back to this reason, Bitcoin is such a massive project and people feel mission driven, but it also, like, there does feel like there's a wrong that needs to be righted, and we're living through this fiat world. So part of it is something that is, once you see the storm, I have this book, did a cover, with commissioned art, and the idea is supposed to be that, at the beginning of your Bitcoin journey, you're in a fiat storm, you just don't realize it yet. But that we're all living in this storm, and once you see it, once you see the problems that have been caused from the corrupted money, then certainly you're working in self-interest and trying to better yourselves for you and your family and for those around you first and foremost. But at that same time, that can be true where you're working on a project that's going to right a lot of wrongs, and it's not going to suddenly make the world a perfect place,
right?
And be utopia. But that when you recognize that and key in on it, it is much easier to be mission driven in a authentic or organic way.
We've seen this get worse this week with the Biden administration proposing a 46% capital gains tax, which is absolutely bonkers.
Crazy. To
the point where I'm like looking at other places to live.
Well, we're going to follow Canada apparently in their lead. Did you see they did 60%? I think it's 66%.
It makes absolutely zero sense. And then we also printed, I think it was $100 billion this week.
$95 billion in foreign aid.
Yeah, just like purely for foreign aid, for things that are not even within inside of our borders. And I kind of I think about this whole, like, just all of this and this entire movement in this space feels like what I imagined the founding fathers were like leading up to like the Revolutionary War, and like the tyranny that they were fighting against was actually relatively low taxes compared to what we're facing today. I think it was like 2%, 3% taxes.
Way lower.
And the Boston Tea Party, they're just like throwing shit off their shit. And they're like, nah, fuck this. And if you look at the ages, we were talking about this in a couple episodes ago, the ages of like the founding fathers, it was like 18, 24, 22, 26. And then like, I think it was George Washington was like the old man in the room, whatever. He was like 40 years old.
He's younger than me.
Yeah.
No, I gave a presentation, not last week, but the week before at BitBlock Boom. And it was titled, Nothing More American Than Bitcoin. And it wasn't designed just to be a, as American as apple pie type discussion, but I actually went through kind of the parallels between the intended structure of government of the United States and talked about how really the founding fathers create, when people think about the Constitution, they think about the Bill of Rights. They think about the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, Third Amendment. And I can't remember who told me to watch this speech, but somebody had, it's that way everyone typically learns about anything, but it was this speech that, not really a speech, but it was the opening statement that Antonin Scalia had given before Congress, where he talked about what makes America exceptional and how when he talks to, he was he's since passed, but he was a Supreme Court justice. And he talked about how when he talked to law students and typically would ask them what makes America great or what differentiates America, what's distinct about it, they will typically say those things like First Amendment, Second Amendment, right against unreasonable search and seizure. But that what really makes America exceptional is the structure of government, and that was put in place with these contradicting powers specifically to prevent the centralization of power.
Right.
And that when you start to understand the dollar and the current construct of it, not what it was 100 or 200 years ago, that it is the single greatest thing that's undermined our structure of governance, because within this very intricate system of checks and balances to prevent the centralization of power was a bicameral Congress that was funded by taxes. They had the right to tax, the authority to tax. And that when you severed the connection of money to something in the physical world, and you had this entity called the Fed that could print money unilaterally, then they could start to finance the government without actually having to tax the people. And that severance of money from gold actually allowed the representative government to become detached with the consent of the governed. And that when you think about the parallels in Bitcoin of these, that when I think about, and it's the point that Antonin Scalia was making, is that there's a lot of other countries that have more perfect Bill of Rights than the United States. But he describes of what the founding fathers would call parchment guarantee, that it's not worth the paper it's written on. And that when you read the Constitution of the United States, it jumps right into the structure of government. It like there is some preamble about, trying to create a more peaceable union, but the whole document is just what the executive branch can do, what the judicial branch can do, and what the legislative branch can do. And that the output of that system and the contradicting powers and the separation of powers is that separation is what would guarantee the rights of the minority or ultimately guarantee the Bill of Rights. That the input was the structure of governance, the output was the guarantee of rights. And that there's very similar parallels to Bitcoin, is that the actual structure of Bitcoin is what allows for these properties to emerge, like its fixed supply and why it's credible and why it's resistant to censorship. And so the input is the structure and the output are the properties that we actually benefit from. And that you start to realize that the dollar is the greatest thing that's actually undermining the structure of government. And that here's this thing, Bitcoin, that can actually restore that simply by taking the fly out of the ointment. But the point you were making, which made me think of this, is that as part of that talk, I brought up, this idea that there's certain rights that are inalienable. They don't come from government. They don't come from society. They're innate. And but I linked it to William B. Travis, who was one of the 250, 300 men, women, and children that was there at the Alamo, defending the Alamo. And he wrote this beautiful letter that's about as American as it comes. But it was before Texas was part of the United States. And it's generally known just as the Travis letter. But he, in the letter, he says something along the lines of, the enemy has demanded surrender. I have returned the call with a cannon shot. Like literally he fired a cannon.
Yeah.
Like that's my answer to you. I'm not surrendering. And says that, he'll stand the post and, he won't retreat. He'll die the death of a soldier. And it's a phenomenal artifact of both Texas history and U.S. history. But then you figure out that Travis is 27 years old.
Right.
And when you start to think about the, what are our rights, or, not having to ask for permission to do things that are very clearly or logically within our rights to do, and that it doesn't come from government, that oftentimes people then retreat to the idea that like, hey, am I actually going to, fight this, or, what are the chances? And I think it's important for people to remember that the founding fathers, people like Travis, were in their 20s,
kids,
and that we're grown adults. And when we're sitting there looking at things that don't make sense, and they're not securing our own border, but they're sending $95 billion, and they're a bunch of Congress men and women, waving, foreign flags,
right,
in the Capitol building. Like, what are we doing here?
Don't worry about it. We just print more money, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's
like the thing that connects that government to us is taxes. And it's like, not only the thing is that is so egregious about it, not the fact that they suggest 44% capital gains tax, which I agree, it's like it starts to get the level where it's like, should I leave? But that doesn't pay for our government. No. The money printing does.
Right. Yeah.
It's a charade.
So you get it's almost like a double tax. It's like you get taxed and then you get taxed with inflation constantly. And
but like to the point, $2 trillion, like our deficit this year, $2 trillion.
This year alone.
We're
only in April.
Federal debt's like 35 trillion, right? Yeah. So they're bringing in something like 4 trillion in taxes, something in the order of magnitude. But that means they're spending $6 trillion. And then when they decide to issue $100 billion, not to secure our border, but to go fight some foreign wars that are not popular, that's all just coming out of the money printer, right? So if they had to actually tax us, if Congress had to come to the American people and say, we want another 100 billion, and we're going to tax you for that, it would be
almost
all
unanimous.
out outcry.
Like, no way, we're not
Zero
doing that.
chance. All those people out of Congress. The ability to print money undermines the structure of government because it does detach the representative part of the government from the actual consent of the government, which was the whole idea.
What's crazy is like, even if you're not a fucking Bitcoiner and you work in the government as a politician, it's like you should read a goddamn Dave Ramsey book to understand how a basic business runs.
I saw an old Saturday Night Live clip of that, basically like, so wait, if I don't have the money to buy this, can I buy it? And he's like, no. And then she's like, well, wait, let me get this situation wrong. What if I had the money and then I lost the money and I want to buy this thing? Can I buy it? And he's like, no. But it's like, it's so dumb that like we have to have this conversation. But like the war bonds, like that's used to be how they would raise money for a war. Was like, and if you didn't agree
this
with
was
it,
when we were still in the gold standard, right?
Yeah. And it's like, if you didn't want to participate in supporting that war, you don't buy war bonds. And so like it had some level of control on what Congress or whatever government you want to look at us. That's
essentially a vote of like, yeah, I guess I support the war, or no, I don't support the war.
Right.
Yes.
Whereas now they just completely bypass that mechanism.
They don't even have to ask us.
And our taxes are so hard to even like calculate and pay and shit that people feel so far removed from that.
Yeah.
Until like one month a year rolls around.
And maybe why I feel like this is a spiritual, like, because I think that, look, I've lost a lot of hope in the younger generation because you see, and I talk about it, I feel like we talk about this every show, is like, we got people arguing over bathrooms, what bathroom you go to, and all kinds of stupid shit that is like, this has gotten ridiculous. Carbon credits on fucking, what your carbon footprint is. Like the level of ignorance that we've gotten as a society in the US is just, it's absurd to me that what conversations are happening in Congress about these societal issues that seem to take forefront in so much of the media's attention. And it's like, it makes you start feeling like, at least me being older than you guys, it makes me feel like, man, we're doomed because
it's a distraction as they're driving the bus right off the cliff.
Right. But like,
it's like, but have you heard any intelligent argument from anybody in politics of like, how do you reverse this at this point?
No, I think that it is, my personal view is that it's so detached from reality that there are certain non-rigorous thinker, maybe they're just truly 100% corrupt. There's the circle of economic thought generally, I don't say I'm called a theory, but modern monetary theory, even though it's not an economic theory, it's something that was created like 10 years ago, that you can print money and
answer your problems.
And if you're the issuing government, then you can do that, and that's the way the economy works. And you print money and you pay for things, and you print money and you pay for things. Not that logical explanation that you're using in the real world, and that politicians think that is the way the world works, and that when you're the U.S. government and you have the biggest money printer and you have the biggest debt engine and you have the biggest army, you think that can go on forever. Right, and they actually think that. They actually think they can print money and it goes on forever. And there's, after the financial crisis, people will say, or there was a common trope that was, it's crazy, it's not going to end well, but they had to do it. And they say this about a lot of things that, might apply to different things, but consistently about the bailouts of the banks and the money printing.
Let them burn.
Don't get me started. I'm trying to resist not grabbing the hat.
I know,
Don't get me started on the banks.
Yeah.
Let them burn is what it was. Yeah.
But when you think about it, there's no logical connection between it's crazy. Yeah, it was crazy. It's not going to end well. And this third idea of they had to do it. And so I just think that, maybe they know that it's crazy. Maybe they know it's going to end well, but they think they have to do it. But I more so think that the majority of them think that this idea that we all learned as kids, I talk about it in the book, that we learn as kids that money doesn't grow on tree and there ain't no such thing as a free lunch.
Unless you're a bank, a politician, or like a
that
American
they literally
car
think
maker.
that you can print money and that it grows on trees, and that the very logical common sense consequences don't exist in the world.
I think a lot of it comes from like their self-preservation too. Like, I mean, most politicians, I won't say all of them because I don't like to say all, but most of them, at least the ones that I've had experiences with, which are a lot. I used to work for the House, and but a lot of them are there because they wanted to be a congressman. They wanted to be a senator. They want to be president. And it's like a career aspiration for them. And so then when you're there, to not lose this thing that is now a path towards, okay, I made Congress, I want to be a senator, I want to be president, all that. To not lose that, they kick the can. And so it's almost like, let's get through this. This is going to be the best thing for me right now. And we'll take care of it later. Like, we're in a position of power throughout the world. We got the best military. We got the dominant form of currency. We can kick the can. We'll get it fixed. We'll do this. We'll do that. And we never do. It never is going to change. It's going to take a calamity or a catastrophe, in my opinion, for things to really come back to what they would need to be.
You need like Anonymous to go like hack into all the banks and just delete half of the USD in existence.
Right.
Just press the delete button and see what that does.
It's all gone.
Yeah.
Realistically, and this like comes back to my origin story of Bitcoin, the same thing that we're in of why they're going to have to print more money. If you print money, people will figure that out via market signals, and that the brass tacks of it is that people's time is finitely scarce. Our time in this world is finitely scarce at the individual level, and that you can't trade your finitely scarce time for something that they create out of thin air. And not just from a ideological standpoint. It's like, no, you literally can't survive. And the way that I connect this for people is add up all the human capital that is required, human capital, physical capital, to extract oil out of the ground. The number of hours of human time that it takes to do that, highly complex, tons of inputs, supply chains. So it takes human capital, know-how, as well as, okay, now we got to put those in physical capital, rigs, drills, supply chains, refineries, pipelines, all of that. And then say, oh, I can buy that barrel of oil in return for zero work.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what's functionally happening, and human beings consciously or subconsciously figure this out. Most of them subconsciously, that they can't do that, because then they can't take the thing that they don't know where it's coming from, but it's getting easier and easier to get, and turn it into things that they need to survive, like food, clean water, healthcare, a car.
Right.
And so that the money printing apparatus is actually what causes the economic structure to fracture, and it does end in hyperinflation. And a lot of people don't like to think about hyperinflation because it's uncomfortable, but it is the logical conclusion of creating trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars out of thin air. And that, I think the positive of it, because if I hadn't figured out Bitcoin, you mentioned, it's like I figured out the money printing was the problem before I figured out Bitcoin. But if you just figured out the money printing was a problem, it would be very easy to be pessimistic on it.
Well, that's what I was going to just ask you. Is like, what was that like when you figured that out, but you didn't have an answer to it? Or
The good thing was it was like I was like literally going down these paths in parallel, and I was starting to understand this thing gold before Bitcoin. So at the time it was, well, maybe we'll go back to gold. I've since kind of figured out through that process that the dollar and fiat currency is actually a demonstration of gold's failure as money, and that we were never going to go back. We were only going to solve it by addressing the problems that allowed gold to fail in this thing called the dollar and the ability to sever it from gold and be printed to the trillions. That we'd only solve it if we found a solution, and that we weren't going back, but that it would be very easy to be pessimistic if you didn't see this light at the end of the tunnel. And the light at the end of the tunnel is not, even though hope itself is a very important thing, it's not, hope as a strategy. It's, hey, there's this tool, Bitcoin, and yeah, the money's failing, and it would be far worse if the money were to fail and there weren't something that we could actually reboot the economic system on. But the existence of that thing, Bitcoin, is what will kind of hold us back from the brink, in my view, saying like, imagine Venezuela hyperinflating, or Lebanon hyperinflating, or Argentina hyperinflating. Well, the dollar is still functional as a currency, but what if that thing goes?
Right.
And there wasn't another working currency. And the existence of that working currency, Bitcoin, is the thing that, allows for, I think, for anyone who's working on it, but or not, that has seen it and figured it out, despite the chaos that is DC, the politicians, the corruption, that ultimately, fuels this, security state, but more consequentially, this state that's destroying the money, and the economic engine that underpins it, is that, hey, we've got the solution. And it's very easy to be optimistic when you have the solution in hand. You just got to go out and, help educate people about it and basically distribute knowledge.
That little graphic you had in there, it was like, I think it was like your first article you wrote, or your first blog, or whatever. I'm old. I don't know what to call it. And then where it's at today and how much money had been was that what that graph is?
Yeah, I think so. Oh yeah, like the first
thing you wrote,
like the are you talking about the index table where I just showed the amount of
yeah. Did you read it yet?
No, I haven't read it yet. No,
dude, you gotta. What do you know what page it's on? I'm sorry, because I was looking at it.
Is it a table or a chart?
Yeah, it was like a table.
Yeah.
And the numbers are crazy, dude, because we're talking about like 7 years, not a very long period of time. And probably when
is it inflation numbers?
Well, it's the amount of money. It's just absurd.
It's I'll let Jake see this for the first time. You can read some highlights, but so it's the original date that I started writing, the dollars in circulation at the time, the value of Bitcoin at the time, the value of oil in dollar terms at the time, the value of gold, and the S&P.
So each of these are like blog posts or newsletters?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what was the amount of dollars in circulation at the first one?
So $3.85 trillion in circulation, July 26, 2019.
2019.
And so go to the end.
And the end is May 3rd, 2023, $8.61 trillion in circulation.
That's insane to me.
A little over twice.
Yeah.
In 4 years?
Mm-hmm.
And
that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
That's not sustainable.
And so, and that's the thing that fuels everything. And so that was the thing that I had come to the conclusion of before Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would happen.
Right.
And if you can understand why, not just that it will, that in the sense of, well, they print money because, so it has to do with the ultimately the degree of leverage that that ultimately can't go away in the dollar system. It can only collapse. Mm-hmm. It can't be fixed. And to give you a sense of when I figured this out, it was I was trying to figure out why they had to put money in the system in the first place post financial crisis. Why they have to do, if I was going to figure out why what's going to happen when they unwind quantitative easing or the digital creation of money by the Fed. Why'd they have to do it in the first place? And so at the time, 2007, there was 52.7 trillion of dollar denominated debt in the US system. And that's very vanilla debt. Auto loans, mortgages, student loans, credit card debt, state, local, federal debt. Basically saying it's not derivatives. It's not what people would hear about in the financial crisis of like CDO, CDX, these synthetic things. It's just very vanilla debt that is you owe X amount of dollars at X time, what you would traditionally think of as debt. 52.7 trillion. At the time, in total existence, there was only about $900 billion.
Wow.
Okay.
That is crazy, dude.
Yeah. And then more problematically, in the banking system, there was only about $350 billion.
What time was this?
2007.
2007. Okay.
So
$350 billion is what was in the banking system.
Yeah.
2007 to 2019, it went from 900 billion to 3.83 trillion.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
And
and to think, sorry, I'm jumping on. So there's $52 trillion of debt.
A very vanilla debt, yeah.
And $350 billion in banks?
Yes.
That's, I don't even know what the percentage is, less than 1%. Right?
Shouldn't the alarms have been going off at that time? And it's like, should only be getting worse over time?
Right.
Like, wouldn't you think there'd be like, oh shit, like warning.
Yeah.
Like,
and so the way I think about it is a leverage ratio, debt to dollars, because only debt can pay dollars. Obviously, you can restructure debt and you can assume, wells for, defaulted debt, but you want to keep your things. You got to pay the debt.
Right.
And so a treasury bill can't pay debt. Only dollars can pay debt. So each dollar had been leveraged or lent out approximately 150 to 1. And so,
gosh, that's crazy.
It was really only possible because over the 40 years leading up to the crisis, that each time there was a business cycle contraction, there was this slow drip of new dollars, which was the Fed lowering interest rates. But the only way you can lower interest rates is by introducing more dollars.
Okay.
And
why is that?
Really, at
Can
the
you
end of the
explain
day,
that? Why is it because you need those new dollars to pay off?
Think about, and this is where I'll get a little bit economic theory on you, but I'll keep it really basic. Think about any supply and demand market. If we're thinking about supply and demand of dollars, and if the rate of interest on dollars is the kind of the somewhere balancing demand for dollars to borrow and people willing to supply dollars to borrow, the only way for a centralized entity like the Fed to reduce interest rates is to increase supply. If they reduce supply and you had a comparable amount of demand, you'd increase the price of that thing.
Okay.
So they use a lot of fancy terms. They talk about a lot of fancy tools, but at the end of the day, the only way to lower interest rates is to introduce more dollars, to basically shift the supply curve. And so what they had done from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s was each time there was a business cycle that otherwise would have allowed this credit system to contract and heal itself, they would, rather than letting debt be restructured and written off and bad debts go away, they would introduce more dollars to, in aggregate. Of course, during that time would companies file for bankruptcy, but the system as a whole was getting more and more leverage because the Fed was not allowing it to deleverage. They were, quote, smoothing out business cycles.
We have to do this.
Well, right. But before it was kind of like, it was more measured of like, let's do this more tactically. But what it was doing was allowing existing debt levels to be sustained and then grow. And then next time it would start to come down, they'd introduce, again, far more slowly than they had to do in the financial crisis.
Rather than restructuring and killing off some debt.
And so this detachment of basically the debt stack to the money only happened or was made possible when the dollar the dollar was severed from gold in 1970s. And so like that 52 trillion to 900 billion or 350 billion in the banks, I think the 350 billion in the banks is the most relevant because the other 600 billion was like physical cash. If you think about people with mortgages, liabilities in the banking system can really only be funded by
debt,
dollars in the banking system.
Okay, yeah, because most those banks got they're the ones who are lending this money out, creating this debt.
Yeah,
right? And so if they got 52 million, maybe it's not all with the banks, but like they got 35 trillion out, and they've got 350 billion.
So yeah, in total banking system, right? So 52
Banks
trillion of
banks are the
liabilities, $350 billion. When the financial crisis happened, those liabilities started to cause basically waterfall effect defaults. And that 52 trillion was collapsing. The only way to prop it up was to massively inject dollars to shore up a ton of leaky holes in a boat, right? How if I got $52 trillion of debt liabilities,
it's like, hey, we're going to meet all your debt obligations. We're going to make everything right. But we're not telling you is this shit's going to be worth a lot less here in about 2 minutes.
Yeah. And so that dynamic between the degree of debt and the amount of dollars is what dictates that more dollars must be created, because it otherwise can't be sustained. And it's so far detached from reality that it's not like a, struggle to restructure and then we go on from here. It's that the whole system would collapse. It would feed on itself. And the only way it's designed to work is to induce more credit. So from that point where we were at 52 trillion of debt liabilities, now I'd have to check the latest quarter. It comes out quarterly. It's 100 trillion.
Oh my gosh.
They're like 98 trillion.
And how much money's in the banks?
So now, like they've printed, now it's like 9 trillion, or maybe they've taken some money out in the last year, 8 to 9 trillion. So you could say, well, it's delevered because it's now 10 to 1, but there's still, we've gone from 2007, a unsustainable credit system, to a credit system that's now 40 to 50 trillion larger. And that absolute level of the debt, and it's in like that 90 trillion gap that 91 trillion gap between approximately 100 trillion of liabilities that exist today in terms of debt, and approximately 8 to 9 trillion of dollars is what will dictate that they're going to, if from when I started writing it was 3.6 trillion, and then when I ended it was at 9, why they will also have to print
more,
another trillion, because that 90 to 100 trillion of now existing debt liabilities has to be supported, or the entire US banking system collapses. And it's going away either way. But in their world, they can't allow that unwind to happen, and like it has to happen by force, and they'll print more money before they'd ever let the credit system collapse, because it's the only thing that actually allows their system to remain tethered.
So
I mean, I knew a lot of this, but once I'm rehearing a lot of this, I'm terrified.
I was going to use that same word. It's terrifying.
I'm like, buy more Bitcoin.
Right. I know. How do you see it? How's it end? Like, how's it end for the banks?
So I think that I think there's no way of there's no way for the dollar not to hyperinflate.
Right.
Okay. And that's not meant to scare people or be dystopian. It's just the consequence of you print trillions of dollars and you can't keep getting barrels of oil out of the ground and selling for things that require no cost. And they're going to have to do that over and over and over again. And also there's this other solution, Bitcoin, where you can either choose to store value in a form of money that can't be printed by anybody and that nobody controls, and that is trustless. That the only reason that Bitcoin is able to do that is because it removes the need for trust. With a system, either that you can store money or you can store your value in a form of money that can't be printed, or you can store your value in a form of money that is easily printed, and they do it over and over and over again. And that your money loses its value. So you're doing other things to try to solve the problem. But the only way to solve the problem of broken money is with a better form of money. You can't solve the problem of broken money with a better house or, a rental property, or, money serves a very important and distinct function within an economic system to actually coordinate trade and commerce. And so that when you recognize that you can't save the same unit of value in both the dollar and Bitcoin at the same time, you can store a certain percentage of your value in dollars and a certain percentage of your value in Bitcoin. But the actual unit of value, you can't save in both the dollar and Bitcoin at the same time. If I get paid for work today, or if I sell a book, it took me time to create the book. I have to choose, it's $30. I have to choose, am I going to keep all 30 of it in Bitcoin, 29 in Bitcoin, 1 in Bitcoin, or the equivalent? And so when someone's deciding to opt into Bitcoin, they are at the same time opting out of the dollar, marginally for each kind of transfer or each value exchange. And so the other side of dollar hyperinflation is rapid Bitcoin monetization. And that I don't know at what point in time that happens. It might be if every 1 out of 20 people understand Bitcoin. It might be if 1 out of every 10 that there will, Bitcoin's not causing the dollar hyperinflation. What's causing hyperinflation is the money printing, but the two are related. You can hit the exit. And so I think that there's no escaping the fact that when the dollar hyperinflates, there will be economic instability. You can't go from a world of excess, debt riddled, all the problems that come with systems saddled with debt, but also companies that are functionally zombies that otherwise wouldn't exist if the money printer hadn't been there, to a period of great prosperity without some pain in between. But I look at it and say, well, if Bitcoin wasn't there, then we wouldn't have this thing to fall back on. And the people that have Bitcoin are going, there are periods in history that everyone lives in their short window where they just think that there's always progress. But there's periods of history where, in aggregate wealth is destroyed. Look at, for Venezuela's sake, Venezuela, Argentina, currencies fail, wealth gets destroyed. Everyone, what that means in aggregate is Greece, that people's standard of living declines on average, right?
Yeah.
But that then Bitcoin provides this source of stability, and that it might turn out that amount of pain is so much less that it is. I mean, it's certainly more brief than if Bitcoin didn't exist, but that Bitcoin will actually monetize very rapidly once it becomes clear that the dollar is going the way of the bolivar. And there's no way also, like, we have to go through that. Like, sometimes you want to go around the storm. The only way is through.
Well, that's what I'm saying too, is like the only way to fix this is a catastrophe. Like that's the only way. But where does the role of like foreign American debt held by foreign countries, like, is there any role that our money printing is playing on that? Because what I've thought about before is like a lot of our debt is owned by foreign countries, other countries. And when we're continuing to print, and Bukele actually has talked about this in kind of an ancillary way, but when our debt is owned by a foreign country and we continue to print, I feel like we're decreasing the value of that debt that they're holding from us. Am I looking at that wrong? Because if I'm one of them and I'm like, I'm not going to keep buying your debt up because you're constantly devaluing it all the time. But then I'm like, I don't know the role that the dollar plays in it because it is a dominant currency. Am I way off on that? Or is there
I don't think you're way off, but I think that the economic incentive, and it's also the reason why people in Washington, D.C. that are totally detached from reality think they can do this forever, is they think, well, we can print away the value of our debt. But there is no, people often talk about a debt jubilee. There's no such thing as a debt jubilee.
Yeah.
We're all going to pay the price.
I can't be the only one wearing my hat.
We're all going to pay the price for our parents and grandparents getting us in massive amounts of debt. And that when that unwinds, the consequences is economic instability and economic deterioration, and that gets fixed by people that are willing to go fix problems in terms of figuring out how to, figure out a business and deliver a product to market. And so when they're printing money, it is causing all of the holders of that debt to have less of an economic incentive to continue to hold it. But people oftentimes will look at these foreign governments that hold the debt. The only reason they hold the debt is because they need some dollars. And they look at it and say, well, the dollar's losing all of its value. At least I'll be compensated with some rate of interest. But the American people hold the vast majority of the debt. The primary asset in the Social Security Fund is U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not really this economic incentive that is distinct between foreign holders of U.S. debt and citizen, U.S. citizen holder. It's that any citizen, any entity, foreign or domestic, that's holding it has less and less of an incentive because they know they're printing money, and that if I was going to lend you, dollars for 30 years and I was going to take the note back and say it was $100 million, and I know that 100 million is going to purchase 50 million, why would I continue to do that?
Right.
And so, one of the things I also talk in Bitcoin is the great definancialization, is this idea that that this is going to create a cycle. And at the time that I wrote it, there was 17 trillion, and this is not just the US. So if I mentioned that the US credit system is about 100 trillion, the global kind of market for financial assets is something like 400 trillion. Not all of that is debt, but a lot.
So like 1/4 of it's US.
The
American dream is financed.
Yeah.
And but at the time that I wrote, there was 17 trillion of negative yielding debt, which was all sovereign debt. And think about how nonsensical that is. It's basically, I'm paying you to lend you money, is what negative yielding debt represents. It only could exist because the Feds, or not the Fed technically, but central banks all over the world were out there printing money and buying debt, or having a negative interest rate on deposits. Thing is that, imagine a negative yielding debt instrument. I'm paying you to lend money to you. Doesn't make any sense. But the holder of that could say, I can either hold this sovereign debt that I know is getting debased and that's going to purchase less, or I could convert it into Bitcoin. How about I sell this financial asset? First get dollars and take the dollars and convert them into Bitcoin. And so what I see happening is, and what I refer to Bitcoin as the great definancialization, it's going to create this loop where people are going to figure that out. It's going to start with things that are absolutely crazy, like negative yielding debt. It's going to go out to things like municipal debt, where you're making 1 or 2%, but that the currency's devaluing faster than that because food at the grocery store is going up 10 to 20% a year. Gas, the gas station, same thing. So people marginally start to figure out, they sell those financial assets to accumulate Bitcoin. That pressures the value of financial assets and impairs the credit complex, probably the ability to issue more debt, because you need higher asset prices to issue debt against. And then that's basically going to induce the Fed to have to print more money. Like, imagine somebody holding US debt that's like, nope,
we don't want it.
We don't want it anymore.
Right.
There has to be a buyer of that in order to prevent interest rates from just skyrocketing. And then when you think about the federal government that's 35 trillion in debt and that 2 trillion deficit, one of the things that's causing it to explode is this higher cost of interest. So basically then the person that has to buy those assets is the Fed. They do that by quantitative easing. Then that restarts the cycle of people connecting that, oh, maybe I should sell this financial asset to buy Bitcoin, or sell this other monetary asset, this other form of money that's getting debased. And so, but through that process, the economic system will actually heal. It will go from hyper-financialized to non-financialized. It's not to say that there won't be stocks and bonds. It will just be like a small fraction of what it is today. Like, talking about like 1/100th or less.
Right.
And that the greatest benefit is that people who are just delivering value in the real economy won't have to become stock traders after their day job.
Right.
The guy who goes and gets oil out of the ground will just be able to get oil out of the ground and be paid in a form of money that can't be printed. Same for the teacher, same for the butcher, because it really is not only ridiculous and chaotic that, basically all of society has to go work from, 8 to 5 or whatever they're doing to deliver value to other people, and then say, okay, now I'm going to have to figure out what stocks to pick.
Right.
In order to keep up with inflation.
Yeah.
And that there will be, and I like to say there's something very cathartic about once you're able to save in a form of money that can't be printed. It's like taking an 800-pound gorilla off your back that you didn't know was there, because then you can just start to focus on delivering value without having to essentially run on this hamster wheel. And so there is a very, kind of positive at the, light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
But the other side of that is like, we got a real problem. And to get across this chasm, to think that it's just all roses, I think is a little naive or ridiculous.
Yeah, I think it's delusional. All right, I know we're getting maybe short, but I've heard you say before, because a lot of people talk about Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation, and I've heard stuff, you're like, Bitcoin is not a hedge. What do you mean by that?
Actually, on that, so in your presentation that's online about that, I sent that to my dad, and it's one of the few pieces of like Bitcoin literature that he's actually like consumed. But the fact that it was a video and it was entertaining, I was like, watch this. And let me tell you, he is more convinced than ever, which is a really fucking hard thing to do with him. And finally, so I had the conversation with him the other day, because he was been like preaching down my throat, 401k. And I was like, Dad, like, you should have listened to me when like Bitcoin was like 8,000.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was like, I should have. He was like, I should have like liquidated part of my 401k and put it into Bitcoin. I'd be sitting on millions now.
But see,
so
think
you
about
played
it now,
so you played a part in that. I just want to say that.
Yeah, and that's great, but now he's going to go look at his, 401k, what assets are in there, and sell some and maybe buy the Bitcoin ETF, or figure out how to get some out.
That's the best thing about the ETF to me, is like, because I got a 401k from my Anadarko days and oil and gas time. And I'm like, I want to do something with it, but I couldn't. And now I'm like, now I finally can. So,
yeah. But my point is, they're going to have to find that he's going to sell financial assets to buy Bitcoin.
Right. Right.
And the world heals. The world heals through that process. But yeah, in that presentation, it was kind of funny because I created that presentation. I wrote an article called Bitcoin is Not a Hedge. And so it was a well thought out framework. But I think I had the flu leading up to that. And I had been on my back for a week. And I threw the presentation together very quickly, and I was still not feeling great. But it's probably been like the single piece of content that's been as popular as it has. And the whole idea behind it was helping somebody connect. I kept getting this question over the period of 2020, end of 2021 through 2023 of inflation is increasing significantly. I heard that Bitcoin was supposed to be a hedge against inflation. It's going down. Why is Bitcoin not a hedge to inflation? Or why is Bitcoin not the thing that people told me it would be? And my explanation for that is, well, you were told wrong. It was based on a misunderstanding. Bitcoin's not a hedge against inflation. Bitcoin's actually the permanent solution to it. And there's something very different to something, or different from something that is hedging dollar inflation and something that is designed to permanently replace it. Bitcoin is designed to permanently replace the dollar. There are other things that might hedge dollar inflation, like things that are correlated to, like directly correlated to things like dollar inflation, like rents, or high, very large cap equity stocks that have predictable dividends. But just as, only a house, a new house, if you get a house that's mowed down in a hurricane or a tornado, the only thing that's going to fix that's a new house. If you got a damaged roof, the only thing that's going to fix it is a new roof. Broke car, only thing that's going to fix it is a new car. Only thing that can fix a broken money is a better form of money, and that Bitcoin adoption happens as knowledge distributes. So if you think about it as a time series, as more time goes by, more books get produced, more podcasts get recorded, more people come to understand Bitcoin. As they do, they adopt it, and that that causes these big adoption waves and then retracements and then adoption waves. And that if you were to look in a very short time horizon and say, well, inflation, dollar inflation is running rampant and Bitcoin's going down, therefore Bitcoin didn't hedge inflation, you're failing to see the forest for the trees. And Bitcoin is the only thing that is truly uncorrelated to the dollar. And that's the thing. Hedges to inflation must be correlated to the dollar.
Right.
Bitcoin is the one thing that is uncorrelated to the dollar because it is the one thing that is competing to replace it, competing credibly to replace it. And that when you start to understand the cause and effect of how Bitcoin is adopted, like as an example, and it was one of the things I talked about in the presentation, is if you've never heard anything about Bitcoin, haven't read it, and you go to the grocery store and your beef costs 50% more, how can you connect Bitcoin to that?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You would have to have acquired knowledge some place, far previously in the past, read a book, started to hear about how Bitcoin is actually the solution and the problem is the money printing. And then you go to the store and you see beef costs 50% more than it did 4 years ago. Say, I need to get some Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
But so if you connect that idea that prior knowledge is necessary, prior knowledge of Bitcoin is necessary to Bitcoin adoption, typically happens with someone consuming some form of content and then combining some real world experience like, inflation at the grocery store, inflation at the gas station, Russia getting cut off from SWIFT, people in Canada, truckers protesting without due process, cutting out off their bank accounts, people who donated to those people, cutting off from their bank accounts without due process. That it's this kind of acquisition of knowledge with some lived experience. More and more of that happens over time, but you can't relate it to Bitcoin without that prior knowledge. And that if you combine that with this fact that, and I tell people to poll their local circle or like the people that are closest to them. In my world, I'm out there talking to people about Bitcoin all the time. There's no way that more than 1 out of 100 people understand what's actually happening here.
Right.
Zero chance that the number, if you take 8 billion people and times it by 1%, no way.
Right.
There aren't 80 million people in the world that get what's happening. Or maybe it's 800 million people.
Yeah, either way.
No, 8 million.
8 million.
Or 80 million.
80 million.
Yeah.
There's barely 8,000 of us in this space.
Right.
But that if you accept that no more than 1 out of 100, how could possibly it be a flight to safety if so few people get it and so few people own it on a relative basis?
Mm-hmm.
That it's not, there's inflation, let me adopt Bitcoin. It's I first had to figure out the input, which was Bitcoin's of value fundamentally to the world because of its fixed supply, because it can be credibly enforced, because I don't have to trust anybody, that the only reason that is credible is because it can enforce its fixed supply in a trustless way. That's what makes it credible. They are always printing money, and these two things are related. And then I start to look around the world. And so it's that combination of accepting that it's not a hedge to inflation, that it's not a flight to safety for the fact that so few people own it or understand it, and that prior knowledge is necessary to connecting those things, but knowledge only increases as a function of time and it accelerates. And that if you can start to see it as the permanent solution and recognize that there is a fundamental difference between a solution to a problem inflation, problem printing money, not going to end well, must only be able to fix it with a better form of money, is Bitcoin that thing coming to that conclusion? And then as time goes on and that is reinforced by the events of the world, then more and more people adopt it. And I think it was the most common question that I got from people. It was like, well, why is it not hedging inflation? And so being able to connect for people in a very high level, simple way, but actually with like real facts of the, walk through the credit system and the money printing and connecting the why of Bitcoin. So it educated them on something fundamental about Bitcoin, but then connected something that was probably perplexing a lot of people. And that I think it can be not lazy. A lot of people would say if they couldn't get somebody on the fundamental reason for Bitcoin, they say, oh, well, it's a hedge. It's a hedge to inflation. You should do that. But then if you if you tell somebody some
Right.
actual wrong information,
Then
when it
write
turns out to not be true,
Right.
they write it off. And then, but if you can actually unlock something for them to
Mhm.
be able to see something that they couldn't see before, then they can start to explain the world around them as Bitcoin goes up and down, but consistently up,
Mhm.
while at the same time that the dollar, inflates away.
Yeah, man.
It's been phenomenal. Where are you selling your book at?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've bucked the trend. You can't buy it on Jeff Bezos. I'm not giving my money to him. But you can find it on Safe Dean's website. Either get there from safedean.com or thesafehouse.com/gradually, and safe is spelled SAIF.
That's
so it's
where
there.
I got mine.
I
Got mine in person.
my philosophy.
I
You got
know.
it signed by the author. No
I
big deal.
didn't get mine signed by the author. Thanks
I'll sign it
a lot.
today. No, but Safe's website accepts Bitcoin as payment. Obviously, if you don't understand Bitcoin, you're not going to have Bitcoin to pay for it. But I wanted everyone who came through to buy the book to be able to see that you can actually buy this book for Bitcoin, and that there is something different. You can't buy a book with your treasury bond, your Apple stock. Bitcoin is something different. And ultimately, if it's a good book and it's good content, people will seek it out. So I get to take home more, and willing to risk the wrath of not being on Amazon. But so it's on safedean.com or thesafehouse.com/gradually.
I did not buy mine with Bitcoin. I bought mine with the ultimate shit coin, the dollar. And
there is a 10% discount if you pay in Bitcoin. But and when I sell my book in person here, I use the company that we're building, Zapright, but I'll charge a 10% premium in dollars, because that's what I view as the cost.
Right.
If you're gonna give me your fiat. But there are times where I have dollar costs, so it is sometimes nice to get dollars. But I don't like to ever have more than be it a distribution where dollars are any more than 5% of my business
freaking
treasury.
putting his money where his mouth is. I like it.
Park, you know, like a picture with you with like a cigar and just like lighting it with like $100 bill that's on fire.
Oh yeah, that'd be.
Cash
We
is
need to make
trash.
an AI one for when
Yeah.
we're doing that. Yeah. When you're running for governor, I've heard people say mayor. Dude, you need to skip that. Go straight governor of Texas.
Straight governor. I talk about running for mayor of Austin someday, because again, selfishly, it's like closer to home you are, the more you can control your actual day-to-day quality of life. And born in Austin, never leaving Austin, but don't want to, live in streets that, aren't respected.
Yeah.
So that's really my only interest in politics. It would be to clean up my own home,
Yeah.
or make my own day-to-day life better. But I do think that, especially with things happening recently, like people engaging at the political level is important. I think there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there. And so it is something that I increasingly think about, but I don't think I would ever actually do myself, other than helping the right people do it, because I think I can be higher leverage getting this book out there to people, helping businesses accept Bitcoin as payment through Zapright. And then also it's like, but I do think that the governor of the state of Texas, more so than any other individual, if you're listening, Governor Abbott, or whoever might come behind you, that there is going to be a state versus federal fight constitutionally
100%.
over this.
Yeah.
And that we can either be out there as individuals, as companies, as communities, at odds with this massive federal government, or the state of Texas can recognize just how important Bitcoin is to the state of Texas, to the citizens of Texas, and to, be the ones asserting our rights rather than it be left to individuals. So
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Do we? That leads me to, and it's kind of a big one, so I hope it doesn't go too far, but that's one of the things I get asked a lot, especially when I'm talking to like oil and gas companies and folks that are not in Bitcoin yet, but they're looking at it from purely economic standpoint of like, I can generate more money for my natural gas by looking at Bitcoin mining. Almost, I would say 50 to 75% of the time I'm in those meetings, I get asked, what happens if the government bans it? Which I always kind of take the position of like, that's a major constitutional issue already, but Does that stop them from doing a lot of things? No. So it's hard to argue that that's going to prevent them from doing anything. But also that I think we're reaching a size and a scale where that's going to be really hard for them to do, especially with the ETF now, and that kind of legitimizing it for high net worth investors. But what's your response when people ask you about that?
So I'll answer that. I want to connect in case Governor Abbott or someone passes along to him. The reason why he's the single most important individual is because the state of Texas is the single most important stakeholder, given the energy
Right.
and the importance of energy to the state. And that my view of it is, it would be great if someone like Governor Abbott or people in the state legislature could start to understand Bitcoin, because then they'll be able to realize that this is an industry, that this is solving a massive problem, but that stakeholders in Texas and in the Texas legislature, most notably Abbott, he'll care about Bitcoin when he figures out just how strategic it is to energy.
Right.
Energy is strategic to the state of Texas. Energy is strategic to Bitcoin. It creates this perfect pair. So if you challenge Bitcoin, you're actually challenging the most strategic asset of our state, which is energy. And so that the reason why they will care about it is because of that energy. And we are large enough as a economic system that Abbott is the one that can most credibly and has the most interest, separate from the sound money arguments of Bitcoin, to actually take those rights and defend them with the federal government, more so than a company or an individual, but also any other state. The state of Texas is the most important in that fight. It's the precedent. So that's why Abbott is, in my view, kind of, or whoever's sitting in that governor's seat has the fate of the nation might rest in that person's seat. To your question, on the question of Bitcoin being banned, one plug for the book. There's a chapter called "Bitcoin Cannot Be Banned." So buy the book, thesafehouse.com/gradually.
Drops the mic. Read the book.
Done.
But,
Read the book.
This is the high level, and again, it's a very logically ordered framework, which is there's a decision tree that you have to come to or acknowledge that. Does Bitcoin work? Is Bitcoin functional as money? And my explanation of it, Bitcoin's only functional as money if the fixed supply can be enforced credibly without the need for trust. If so, there's something for the government to ban. If not, there's nothing to ban because it just falls on its own weight. It doesn't work. So first, it's an admittance that the only scenario in which Bitcoin could be banned is because it works. So accept that reality.
That is a very good point
to start. Then think about the actual underlying reason why it works, because you need that to then be able to ask yourself or reason through whether or not it can be stopped. Conclusion you'll ultimately come to is that the only reason that it works is because it can't be stopped. And that while governments can make its use illegal, Bitcoin's both everywhere and nowhere. It would be the largest game of whack-a-mole. It's purpose built to exist beyond governments. It's mined, it's owned in every corner of the earth. All this regulatory, not arbitrage, but regulatory competition. Certain competing interests, geopolitically or otherwise, are going to have an interest to secure the Bitcoin network and have good money. But if you just think about it from a rational perspective, it's like, okay, when are they going to ban Bitcoin? When it's, risen to such a level that it becomes very obvious that it's threatening to the dollar. The only position for a rational economic actor, if they've first figured out the conclusion that it works, that Bitcoin can credibly enforce this fixed supply, and actually, as it grows, it becomes harder to stop because there's more energy, more distributed, more people owning it. Would I, in that position as a rational economic actor, just say, I'm not going to own that thing that's going to go up in value so much that it's going to become obvious to the US government that it threatens the position of the dollar? Or I'll own it, not have the consequence of the reverse side of the reality, which is my dollar got destroyed. You would, in all cases, if you first come to the conclusion of how Bitcoin credibly enforces fixed supply, why it's relevant to own that, and to then have the decision at that future point in time in the very positive for you outcome that the form of money that you held has actually increased some purchasing power rather than gotten destroyed. And then when you think about that in the context of just if you're a pure rational economic actor, that the federal government tried to ban private ownership of gold.
Mm.
There was a law that banned it. Gold didn't cease to exist in the world.
Right.
The dollar got forced devalued the following year and has been devalued 99% since then. But gold didn't go away just because a law said that its use, private ownership of it, is illegal.
Right.
Separately, the government tried to ban booze.
Yeah.
Prohibition.
It made a lot of people rich.
Didn't make booze go away. And that Bitcoin functionally as a technology, the way the network works, is orders of magnitude, if not infinitesimally, harder to prevent than gold, and orders of magnitude more of a benefit than something like booze. So if there is this economic good that is working, that humans need to survive, humans literally need money to coordinate activity, to reliably get clean water, food at the grocery store, gas at the gas station, that you're not going to take a good that has that much tangible benefit, that is that hard to stop, and think that you're going to be able to rid the world of it easier than gold and booze. And so when you kind of put those things together, if you've come to the conclusion you have to own Bitcoin, and then you make the decision, like if they tax at 45%, do we go to El Salvador, or do we, tell the government to, fuck itself?
Yeah.
I like the go fuck yourself option.
I do too. I like going to El Salvador too, though. But
go buy the book.
Yes,
go check it out.
I think Parker,
you're doing great work, Parker.
Yes, you are. You and Safe Dean, two of the most impactful, influential people. I think that the Bitcoin has had. I'm not even talking about Bitcoin mining, but Bitcoin probably that are around, dude. So you've probably contributed to more Satoshi disciples than most people out there, man. So thank you for everything you do, and I encourage everybody to go buy the book. I'm gonna finish reading it and make you sign something. So
appreciate you saying that. Appreciate you guys having me.
Absolutely, man.
Now we get to go to the Bitcoin meetup.
Yeah,
let's do it.
Perfect.